The South African Revenue Services in December of last year released numbers confirming that, according to them, their current undisputed tax debt book sits around 523 billion rand. That is monies due to SARS that are not being contested or under dispute. Effectively, this is money that SARS is simply yet to collect. We're going to take a look at this in a bit more detail with partner and head of strategic engagement and compliance at Tax Consulting SA, Jashwin Baijoo. He joins me on the line now to see if we can make sense of these numbers and what it means for South Africans. Jashwin, lovely having you on the show. Thanks so much for taking the time. Let's perhaps start with the size of this debt book, 500 billion rand to the South African Revenue Services, that on a yearly basis we hear several times throughout the year is looking to continuously collect more tax and is struggling to do so.
Good evening, Jimmy, and thanks for having me on. Good evening to the listeners. So this debt book, just to be clear, is about half of the total debt book, just more than half, because this is purely undisputed debt. And as you've already mentioned, undisputed debt means that taxpayers have not filed any notices of objections, requests for reasons, notices of appeals, etc., but rather it is debt that is the low-hanging fruit per se, and where we saw the biggest increase in a single segment was personal income tax. That went up between November and December by 27.2 billion.
Jashwin, take us through perhaps what this means for the South African Revenue Services. I mean, for the debts to be considered to be legally assessed and for those assessments to not be contested, is it right for them to then assume that all of that is going to eventually be paid to them or due to them? Or is there still a conversation to be had, perhaps around the disputes and the negotiations? We know that SARS often does allow for conversations around payment arrangements and early settlement discounts and all manner of trying to recover these debts. But take us through, just as the debt book sits now, what does that mean for SARS and what does that mean for South Africans?
So what that debt book means for SARS, firstly, is SARS views it as the low-hanging fruit that is prime and ready for collection. Now, when a debt transfers to that debt book, remember, you file a tax return, an assessment is issued, and it has a payment due date. Whatever is owed, let's say 10 million rand in this example, only moves to that debt book once the payment due date has passed and the taxpayer has not engage SARS in either a payment plan or a dispute or a compromise of tax debt. Now, very important to remember is your payment due date is typically the end of the month following when the return was submitted, whereas you may file a dispute anytime within a period of 80 business days from the date of assessment, meaning the time where a dispute is permissible is actually longer than your payment window. And in exceptional circumstances, a taxpayer may ask for condonation for the late filing of the dispute, and that may be done within a 3-year period from the date of the assessment. So as it stands, that 523 billion is uncontested. There's no dispute. But that's not to say that a portion may become disputed in the near future. Now, where there is no dispute at any stage in time, there are possible options for taxpayers. Now, if we look at it from the taxpayer side, well, one, it's a pretty scary number. Two, your largest increase is on the personal tax book. And three, where it is a case that a taxpayer's debt is unaffordable, they may then approach SARS for a payment arrangement or a compromise of tax debt, which entails writing off interest and penalties, asking for a reduced settlement amount, etc.
Now, Jashwin, I want to take a look at the SARS initiative. I mean, they've dubbed it a Project AmaBillions, and they're very clear that its focus is not on increasing the revenue that they're able to generate on paper, but rather on these collections. They've been very efficient from a collections point of view over the last year. We've seen them implement new tools and measures. We've spoken to SARS as well around those implementations in an effort to collect. Take us through, from a SARS perspective, how that kind of focus then starts to tackle this 523 billion rand debt book that they have, but also what it then does from a resourcing perspective and allows them to focus on these collections.
Yeah, correct. I mean, from a SARS perspective, Project AmaBillions is very simply spend 1 billion in resourcing And towards the end of last year, they actually underwent the onboarding of 1,700 new staff in the Pretoria office and the Joburg regions. And you spend 1 billion to collect many billions. It's very much in the name. And what that allows them is additional manpower for targeted collections, because SARS have, over the last few years, implemented what they call a segmented taxpayer model, meaning that different taxpayer segments of society, such as high wealth individuals, crypto traders, gig and social influencers, all fall into their own segments, and SARS implements various collection models depending on the segment. You'll recall last year when SARS announced their revenue results, their compliance program, so their targeted compliance program, yielded an additional 301 billion in collections. I mean, those are not small numbers. And by increasing their manpower, and especially if you consider the fact that SARS now have a modernization program underway, integrating AI and data science into their increased manpower, it simply means that if you have not been contacted by SARS and you have a liability that's outstanding, the chances of you being off the radar, as you would have thought many years ago, are slim in the current age of AI.
Lots that SARS is focused on, and more importantly, the low-hanging fruit in the form of 500 billion plus in a debt book that they would likely aim to recover. More on this will likely follow as the budget speech draws closer. We'll probably hear confirmation from the South African Revenue Services on how it is that they intend to recover this debt book. For now, we'll leave this conversation on that note. Thanks so much to Tax Consulting SA's Jashwin Baijoo for joining us to take a look at the SARS debt book and perhaps what it means for the South African Revenue Services.